Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, I am very pleased to announce a very special guest who is going to discuss with us the ins and outs of the Darwinian theory and why it falls short. This man's credentials are impressive. Molecular biologist and director of Biologic Institute. He completed his PhD at Caltech, has held postdoctoral and research scientist positions at the University of Cambridge, Cambridge Medical Research Council Center, Babram Institute in Cambridge. He worked as a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Protein Engineering, University of Cambridge, and his current research examines the functional and structural constraints on the evolution of proteins and protein systems. He's also the author of a very good book, Undeniable, and it's Dr. Douglas Axe. Welcome to the show.
Hey, it's great to be here.
Well, thanks for coming on. So I read the book, and it's so good. It's one of those where it's not too dry. There's some humor in there, which I always appreciate. And but you're talking about your experiences in the field, and then you're tackling Darwin's proposal. So it's an excellent read. Really appreciate it.
I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Yeah. And I would go ahead and recommend it to our listeners. So the middle chunk of the book is where it gets very good, because for layfolk like myself, that's where the information that's helpful that we can bring up in conversations, that's where the information is for us. And so highly recommend the book. But we're going to talk about the book Undeniable, and so that's why you're on. So if you don't mind, we'll just jump right in.
Let's do it.
All right. Our listeners, the people that come to our site, are layfolk that are in the fray. They're navigating the conversations with the other side, the people that are not compelled by design. And I'm assuming that there is a level of understanding when it comes to Darwin. But let's start really basic. What is the Darwinian theory, and why do you think it doesn't go all the way through?
Okay, why it doesn't work?
Exactly.
Yeah, so natural selection is probably the term that's most often associated with Darwin's theory, rightly so. He wrote his book On the Origin of Species in 1859. At the time, nobody knew anything about DNA or genes, so he referred to a lot of things in his theory that were actually not scientific. They were ideas that were not well founded in anything molecular. So what we call Darwinism today, what you would learn about in a high school biology textbook or college textbook, is really a synthesis. It's sometimes called the modern synthesis between modern molecular genetics and Darwin's ideas of population and natural selection. So the gist of it is everyone's heard of survival of the fittest. The idea is that because we pass on our genetic constitution to our children, and because that passing on is imperfect, there can be mutations that affect the genes that children receive from parents, and therefore those changes can affect how an organism lives life, how it, how healthy it is or how fit it is. And the idea of natural selection is that the ability to leave offspring is being constantly tested by life, and those organisms that do that better are going to leave their genes to more offspring. And that makes sense. There's nothing wrong about it. It's absolutely correct. It has some very significant and actually surprising mathematical limitations to it, but the biggest and most obvious limitation is, okay, so what? That doesn't explain where these things came from in the first place. So the biggest failing is, and I'll just quote the phrase, natural selection may explain the survival of the fittest, but it does not explain the arrival of the fittest, the first origin of new things.
You talk about, so you kind of broached the topic with this story, and the story itself is both funny and sad at the same time, but it's the story of Oracle Soup. And I was wondering if you wouldn't mind sharing the story of Oracle Soup and how that's relevant.
Sure. So I say it's a spoof, but you have to read a little bit into it to know that it's a spoof. I say, culinary scientists have come up with, or they discovered a new soup that's called Oracle Soup. And this is what it does. You have a big pot of Oracle Soup. It looks just like alphabet soup. You got pasta, letters, and numbers swirling around. You cover it You bring it to a boil, you let it cool, and you uncover it, and then on the surface of this soup, you will see spelled out in pasta letters and numbers, detailed instructions for building something new and clever, worthy of a patent. And then copy that down by all means, put the lid back on, reboil, do it again, and you'll get different instructions. Well, of course, you get halfway into this and people are going, hang on, this is not like any alphabet soup I've ever had.
Right.
And what I'm trying to do is bring out how is it that we know, because it's interesting that we all immediately know that can't be true. And what I'm trying to do is explore, first get the reader to recognize, well, yeah, he's right. We all know that can't be true, but then get the reader to think, well, how do we know that that can't be true? And I'm drawing a deliberate sort of connection to another kind of soup that they may have heard of, which is primordial soup, where supposedly in this non-living, on this barren planet where there is no life, you have the right sort of chemicals that come about in some warm pond somewhere, that you get something more remarkable really than oracle soup happening, where you have the A's, C's, G's, and T's of DNA come together and spell instructions that are really more remarkable than anything that we would patent. And that supposedly did happen by accident. So I'm trying to get people to, and I'm assuming that many of my readers are accepting the Darwinian theory. I'm trying to get them in the first pass there to start to see how reasonable it is to view Darwin's theory with a critical lens. And that's what the soup story is supposed to do.
Yeah. And, what you do is really interesting. You appeal to basically intuition, and that's something that, again, layfolk interacting here sometimes see from the other side, where it's it's the science. Go to the science, and your intuition is sort of characterized as this thing that is often wrong. What's interesting is that you point out that there are evolutionists that admit that intuition wants us to go to design, but then we have to cancel that out altogether.
Sure. So I quote Francis Crick as saying, I may not get it exactly right, that biologists must constantly remind themselves that the things we study were not designed, but rather evolved. And it's interesting that someone, a late career scientist like Crick would say, this is something we have to continually remind ourselves of, because when we look at things as biologists, we're wanting to use design language. And I think he was trying to say, be careful when you use that design language and remind yourself that it's not literal. We're not supposed to be taking this literally.
Right. So pointing all of that out, you end up going into the direction of intuition, but you embrace it. And you say intuition is a good thing. And you mentioned a phrase, too, universal design intuition. And right. So what is universal design intuition? What do you mean by that? And why do you say that it's reliable when properly used?
Okay, so I quote early on, I think before I introduced the idea, or before I introduced the term universal design intuition, I quote UC Berkeley psychology professor Alison Gopnik. So I came across this Wall Street Journal article where she's writing actually about the work of another psychology professor named Deborah Kellerman at Boston University. And Kellerman has done work where she's looking at children and how they have this intuition. They attribute complex things in the world around them to a godlike designer. And Gopnik says by elementary school age, children start to invoke an ultimate godlike designer to explain the complexity of the world around them, even children brought up as atheists. And so when I saw that, I thought, this is a good, and she's not agreeing with the design intuition. She's saying it's a fact. Kellerman and Gopnik are both saying it's a fact, and we need to address it by educating kids starting from a very early age and showing them that no, Darwin gave the correct explanation of life, and this thinking that you've got is wrong. It's understandable, but it's wrong. Mm-hmm. But I found myself thinking it's really remarkable that everyone is recognizing that we all have this, and what if it's right? And of course, I'm thinking it is right, but what if you could actually show that it's right? That the sort of elements that we're pulling together in a 4-year-old mind, they actually work. And when they look at a butterfly and think that thing was designed, it's actually correct. And they're actually doing something scientific when they do it.